Good morning to all here. Pacific Daylight Time has changed. I guess, later, fall back, maybe an hour earlier. So we picked up an hour last night. Jana's been waiting an hour for us to come to terms with Hawaii time.
True.
And I wanted to read a quote that I've had above my desk for a long time, and I don't think I've ever mentioned it, but it's somewhat significant in relation to this conversation that we have. Physical concepts are the creation of the human mind and are not, however, it may seem, determined by the external world. In our endeavor to understand reality, we are somewhat like a man trying to understand the mechanism of a closed watch. He can see the hands move and hear its ticking, but he has no way of opening the case. If he's ingenious, he may form some picture of a mechanism which could be responsible for all the things he observes, but he will never be quite sure his picture is the only one which could explain his observation. He will never be able to compare his pictures with the real mechanism, and he cannot even imagine the possibility of the meaning of such a comparison. So I would say, in relation to our discussion, this isn't about agreeing, having faith, having belief, having hope, having any
Jack,
kind of...
sorry for,
Yes.
before you get started in that, can you take a quick picture of that with your phone and text it to us or to me? Or that was a lot to take in.
Yeah, I'll get it to you.
Thank you.
Do you need it now?
Sure or not.
I'll do it afterward. So the concept, though, basically is just saying that things are how they are, no matter how we think they are, effectively. We can think in all sorts of ways. We can come to terms with things as an observer that make sense, but it may not mean it makes all the sense in the world, per se, or in reality. So there's always a potential for gap, and yet our observation is really what we're left with as individuals. What's our observation? What's our experience in that observation? How willing are we to consider what we're doing and leave the edges soft rather than hard, meaning flexible, permeable, because they are. The ideas we have that we make believe are true when they're not true seem to be inflexible and intrinsic to our experience, when in fact we've created that dilemma by making believe something that's wrong is right, or making believe something right is wrong. And that's all induced by our own choices, not something cast on us, a possibility of all possibilities, but certainly not the only possibility. And if there's freedom, certainly being condemned would be an option to feel, because we think in contemptful ways, but it doesn't mean we're actually condemned. Just as he talked about, he may form some picture of a mechanism which could be responsible for all the things he observes, but he will never be quite sure his picture is the only one which could explain his observation. Meaning there's always potentially more within an infinite realm, since it's not based in more or less, it's not based in quantity. To think of it would always be to limit it in some way. Not in reality, but limit it in terms of our own thinking. Morning, Jackie. So if that possibility exists, which I would say, if we're conflicted in any way, we know that it exists, because the conflicts would indicate some assurance about something that's not assured, or some seeming stability about something that's unstable. Some conflict would be natural in that observation. And a reckoning is simply an honest observation of what's happening. And one of the core issues I never bothered to pay attention to is largely what was happening in my experience was my experience. My experience included the feelings I had, the thoughts I had, the feelings I had, the words I used, the rationalizations and justifications I developed, the excuses I used those rationalizations and justifications to support. So my understanding all of a sudden became a function of misunderstanding, because I was trying to make right out of wrong, rather than allow wrong to be wrong and allow then the possible for the possibility for correction to occur. So observing it honestly is really accountability, and accountability is a reckoning with responsibility. Just beginning to act in relation to a level of responsibility that is natural for all of us by accounting for what's happening as it happens. Just taking what I can, what I have, what I'm experiencing, and letting that be enough to start with, rather than think I need to understand every word and every last detail and sort of wrap something around this conversation about life, about reality, about truth, about conflicted thinking, about addiction, in some way that will never change. It becomes once and for all a fixation of sorts, fixed once and for all, like the idea of a drug curing us by having us not feel what we're feeling, or feeling better than what we're feeling and thinking that the fix is in. We've got it done. We've figured it out. Those are short-term satisfactions for long-term pain and the gain of pain in time. By refusing to admit what we're doing presently, we're going to collect tension and pressure and more conflict and make believe that feeling numb to it is a goal, being desensitized to it, rather than allow that awareness that we absolutely have to be seen, noticed, observed, considered, and also expressed. Talking from that point of view rather than the one of, I need to figure it all out first, then I'll get around to feeling better about it, rather than noticing that feeling better in this case is actually just getting better at feeling what we're feeling while we're feeling what we're feeling, which is an indication of what we're thinking that's causing those feelings. May not be causing all of the feelings because there's other sensory data that we're getting, but it's largely what we think about that sensory data that's causing our experience in terms of the words we use, the conflicts we create, the turmoil we seem to suffer, the anguish that we seem to bear. So good morning. Or good day. Good day, whatever the time it is when you're listening, and also know out there as you're listening that you're always welcome to join us or talk directly with me. We can record it. We can use that as a basis for someone new approaching this discussion so other people can see that it's approachable in their experience. Doesn't become something off there somewhere else happening with other people. It becomes immediately something that can be done by anyone, anytime, anywhere, especially now today with the technology that we have. If you have the technology to listen to this, you've probably got the technology to participate in the discussion in some way. And you're welcome at all times. Even if you're uninterested in recording it first, I'd be happy to talk and do whatever I can to share my experience. Any topics of interest today? Any conflicts of interest? Awarenesses? Epiphanies?
Well, Jack, let's yesterday on our walk, maybe we could review the struggle as part of the awareness. Does that make sense? You sort of said it's all part. It's all connected.
Yeah.
We struggle with the obsession, we struggle with the addiction.
Well, the emotional turmoil, mental anguish, inner conflict. Yeah. Well, if we're trying to ride a bike and thinking the way to ride a bike is to pedal backward, we're going to probably not be able to move very well, right? If we're operating something that's designed to function a certain way, and we're operating in the exact opposite way on a bike, typically, if it doesn't have handbrakes, the brake would actually stop the bike from moving. So the possibility of learning to ride it would become very complicated, very difficult, if not impossible. But the learning curve, we feel like we have curveballs thrown at us. The learning curve of those curveballs is beginning to reckon with and observe and notice, oh, the conflict is being caused by something I'm doing that isn't correct. And more than that, if I think it's correct while it's incorrect, I'm going to think I'm not doing it, because it would be absurd to think that I would take the position to do something to both set something up, meaning have a bad thought, have a wrong thought, have a mistaken thought about something, and then immediately conclude that that thought is right and the only thing I can do. And then wonder why all of a sudden the world seems difficult and everybody else seems to be prejudicial against my interest and biased and a potential for threat and at least for the contempt of my opinion and spite and all that other kind of stuff that I dish out because I feel that experience that I've created and don't want to notice is something that I've created. So the learning curve, in my estimation, is really the curriculum. Life's terms don't change. Nature has a pretty clear idea of how it operates because it's been doing it for billions of years and seems to be doing a pretty good job of it for us to continue to survive despite things we've done that haven't complemented it, that have been destructive and toxic. So if we can do that to the planet, we certainly can live that way in our own thinking and have this toxicology in our own. We can study the toxicology of our own thinking. So the struggle being natural would be any deviation from what would be normal would be healthy and would be instinctual because it would favor survival and thriving within the realm of life's terms. Knowing how to plant a seed, you can have all the seeds in the world. If you don't get them into the ground and get them watered at the right time of the year, you're not going to eat. So we can have it all and act like we don't by dysfunctioning in relation to what we have. So I think that's what we were going about yesterday, Gabe, because I think it tied into 6 or 8 other things too.
Yeah, we did a lot yesterday, but I want to go back to your first sentence of what we were designed for or evolved to be, however you want to look at it, is it's not always positive joy, happiness, love. Some of those things were designed to do is fear dangerous situations and be worrisome about lost children and all these things, mourn our dead or whatever. Like there's other things that are part of the human condition that bring turmoil and strife seemingly at the moment.
Yes. So I think that led to the discussion we had about looking clearly at things, honestly, is to start seeing if I'm mourning the loss of my own capacity to function, I'm somewhat blind to all the other things in the world that would be worth noticing are conflicted, are not stable, are not healthy, are not natural. You follow me?
Yeah.
If the lens of my own understanding is corrupt about what I'm doing, I'm going to look out there and see it all in a very, very outsized manner, disproportionate to the actual circumstances. And that doesn't dismiss them and make them all happy, joyous, and free circumstances when they're often laden with pain and sorrow and grief and mourning and all of the other things that go with these ideas of loss and gain, or having too much and not having enough at the same time, and all those sort of conflicted ways of experiencing things. So if I'm looking at it from a point of view that seems to be my viewpoint, and I'm thinking it's the only point, I am disqualifying all the other points that can be made and thinking then they become contrary and antagonistic to my situation. I'm creating that, which then disables or depreciates my ability to actually appreciate what's happening and have any potential for joy or pleasure or happiness in it. Because even conceding something wrong is wrong, there's a certain joy in that. There's a certain satisfaction in beginning to concede something that's accurate and honest. And to think we always need to be right is some indication that we are always wrong. We wouldn't need to feel right all the time if there wasn't something wrong going on. So that oblivion that we're capable of creating, that seeming sleep that we're in, gives us impressions that are untrue that we use to excuse continuing as though we don't know what we're doing. If that's the experience I'm having, I'm never seeing anything outside of me other than a reflection of those things, because I am trying my best to divest myself of having any responsibility for them and thinking of life as difficult, life is hard. God is hateful, vengeful, contemptful. All those things, all of a sudden, I imbue on the most broad issues in life. The biggest things I can. I can even debate that those things exist, but when it comes to using them as an excuse, I absolutely think they do. Which is pretty, again, pretty unusual. I mean, I've had people that I know who don't believe in God and then hate God for the Holocaust, for allowing it. As though there isn't some dichotomy there that should maybe be looked at and considered a little differently. If humans are free to do what we do, then we are free to do everything that's ever been done. Doesn't mean it's right. And that ties right back into the discussion about addiction and this idea that thinking things are right when they're wrong creates a blind spot that isn't real, but within the delusional nature of that thinking, to admit seeing it clearly would be to dispel the rumor we're perpetuating as though it's true. It would literally take apart that whole prowess that we think we earn and achieve and continue to develop in terms of the egoistic, self-centered self we think we are, that narcissistic, absolutely obsessed idea about these thoughts being who I am and having to be perpetuated at all costs. When the cost is actually taking my physical life and diminishing its capacity, undermining its health and so forth, naturally, because of the friction, the anxiety, the stress. It's undermining the body's ability to function freely because we're creating pressure. Unnecessarily, maybe. But given the thinking, it's automatic. It's going to happen if we choose to ride the bike and think pedaling backwards is the way to go. We're just going to be frustrated for a long time and feel incapacitated, feel unable, feel disabled. All those things would be natural. It's a lot like Lewis Carroll in The Looking Glass with Alice.
That's not very fun, though.
Well,
I like
if it's
backwards on the bike.
What's that? You like going forward?
I like going backwards on the bike.
Yeah, well, on some of them now where they don't have the brakes, you can do that. But it's like driving a car backwards. It can be done. I don't see a lot of people try it, other than for very short distances. If you were on the freeway going backward, it would probably be a pretty harrowing experience, not just for you, but everybody else. So a lot of those little metaphoric examples seem stupid and ridiculous, but it's exactly what we're doing within our own thinking, and thinking that somehow this backward idea is going to somehow be true the harder and harder and harder we push. As though there's no way out other than breaking through something that doesn't even exist. We're trying to break through an idea that doesn't, the idea that it's going to work in the wrong way is an idea that will always fail. Like any lie, it's always going to produce a result that's failure. The failure is in fact the learning curve. That's how the absolute reveals itself, and the all-knowing nature of knowing reveals itself in the fact that the potential to learn is coming from the grind, from the disenchantment and the distorted views and the conflicts and the pettiness that we feel in our own experience, and the reduction of what life's possibilities are, thinking all that's now possible is this impossibility and wondering why we feel so demoralized and incomprehensibly demoralized, as the book calls it, the big book calls it. Because there's no survival in that. It's all a death wish. It's literally a contraction to the point. Everything that contracts eventually going to get to a point where it can't contract anymore. Anything that expands can always move forward if there's an infinite realm. Can always expand. That's what the universe is doing right now. There's some contention at some point it will contract again. We'll see. We may not be here to see it directly as in these bodies, but somehow the awareness will be aware. When depression is depressing, it's aligned with what's happening rather than something to get over, something to feel better than, something to think about that. We feel depressed is depressing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're trying to feel better than it, and this is age-old social ills, always trying to feel better than we feel. Drinking started years ago. I mean, if you look at Roman history, you see the downfall was largely partying and excess. Sort of physical delusion created on top of, as an outward action, created on top of the inner delusion that they were the empire. They were in charge of life. They were in charge of the world. They were the gatekeepers and all of the gods that they associated to. They had been given that role. Not humans in general, but them, the Romans. So they fought and 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 they won a lot, and they thought because they were winning, it proved they were right. When in fact it proved they were wrong. They just used force to claim that that's power, when in fact it's weakness and vulnerability that has that seemed to be the case. So that I would call a reckoning, Gabe. That
I
moment.
wrecked it all right.
What's that?
I wrecked it all right.
Well, the difference is, because the word is very similar, is that one is an honest appraisal, and one is the willingness to continue to fight. And the wreckage of our past is really the wreckage of our present in that regard. And the unwillingness to reckon with what's happening is an unwillingness to be honest about our observations. We're feeling what's happening accurately and thinking about it as something that shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, the
And if
noun becomes a verb.
What's that? Now
The
becomes a
noun
verb.
becomes a verb. Yeah, the wreckage
Yeah.
becomes the reckoning.
Same with patience. Patience is an action. The ability to sit for a second, to notice, to be with the experience. You're already there. Now to bring thinking to it, thinking being something we do, being something we are. It's not even a thing, but we are beings having thoughts because we have bodies. Just like if we had a car, we'd have an engine and transmission and suspension and all those kind of things. And if some of them are in non-working order, it doesn't matter how good the engine is. It doesn't matter how good the shock absorbers are. It doesn't matter how good the transmission is. It's not going to function. The tires are flat. You're going to run on flat tires. It's not going to last long. It's going to cause problems. So as humans, we have a broad swath of potential choices that we can make because we're free to think what we want. And that includes not taking an action, not using thought to provoke, to create impulsive behaviors that lead to, or reactive behaviors that are defensive. Those are choices. We're predetermining those choices by being determined about the thoughts we're having as being real, being true, being our only choice. Because interesting that we think of reality in absolute terms, like I'd said a few minutes ago. We can think of reality in absolute terms when it comes to what we're doing that's wrong. But we seem to struggle with reality and truth as a concept that includes everything. Then it is just reality's real. Truth is true. That seems to be a little harder to grasp than this reality we seem to create that isn't reality, but is a forced impression of reality that we then call our reality and wonder why we feel like everybody else opposes us or that we need to fight everything and everyone. It's kind of depressing. Creating pressure in your body is depressing, naturally. Interesting. Compression creates inflammation at the same time. Some things constrict, creates inflammation in other things. It's like a balloon. So the counterpoint is always a point, always a point. And in observing this relative experience we're having, beginning to see that subjective and objective are constant states, and choosing one over the other is just a choice. Doesn't mean the other disappears. It means the investment we have in the positions we take increases, and we want interest. Our interest is what we think is the payoff. And ultimately, that distracted interest is keeping us preoccupied with thinking about things that aren't really happening other than in our own thinking, because we've made it up. We've made up our mind. And then wondering why we're distracted from things that are happening and not paying attention to them in ways that would be meaningful enough not to cause greater problems by avoiding them, which is easy to see in everyday life when you're looking at them honestly. You can see the problems you think you're going to save yourself from by avoiding do not get better 3 or 4 days later. And then the imagined problems go away anyhow because they were never real to begin with. I'm going to reread this quote just since we started there. And Mark, you still with us?
I am.
Okay. Jackie's new. I don't think she was here when I read it earlier, but it sort of makes this point in a really beautiful way. It's a lot more academic than I would write, but I appreciate it a lot because it's clear. Albert Einstein, 1938, The Evolution of Physics, page 31 is where this comes from. Physical concepts are the creations of the human mind. That's the brain he's talking about. And are not, however it may seem, determined by the external world, meaning they're determined by the thinker, the choices. In our endeavor to understand reality, we were somewhat like a man trying to understand the mechanisms of a closed watch. He can see the hands move and hear its ticking, but he has no way of opening the case. If he's ingenious, he may form some picture. I think he was talking about his own experience here, but if he's ingenious, he may form some picture of a mechanism which could be responsible for all the things he observes, but he will never be quite sure his picture is the only one which could explain his observation. He will never be able to compare his pictures with the real mechanism, and he cannot even imagine the possibility of the meaning of such a comparison. So I think that final sentence really wraps up the concept that we're starting. He's talking about essence of reality. And if it's infinite, there's never going to be any comprehensible, apprehensible way of concluding it because there would be no conclusion in it. The conclusiveness of it is the expansiveness, the loving nature, I would say, the generosity, the support, the constant awareness. the constant knowing, not something that comes and goes, not something that's a thinking process, not an evolutionary process, not a process of change, a process of absolute stability, absolute purity, absolute truth, absolute reality, things that are as they are, regardless of how we think. And right now, does not matter whether we think of things correctly, and it did not matter whether Einstein thought of them correctly. They were operating correctly, regardless of what he thought. And he happened to be one of those observers who came up with some pretty interesting ideas that are still subject to contest in terms of the edges and the outer bounds of those ideas. And yet they hold somewhat true, or at least accurate, to the predictions that are able to be created. Kepler was probably the previous individual. I forget when Kepler was hanging around, but he talked about laws of motion and such in ways that were much simpler than Einstein, but they were also reliable enough today to be able to utilize them and determine things almost as accurately as Einstein's theories, though Einstein obviously took a step in a direction that blew open the potential for those observations to be quantified in some way. Excuse me. So if we have our experience, and we're experiencing our experience, we're observing our experience like we observe our thoughts. If we are our thoughts, then we're in our thoughts. And we think we're captive to the thoughts, and we think we're subject to the thoughts, and we now think we're subjects of the thoughts, meaning who I am is only what I think. And now my subjective nature becomes obsessed, which is a narcissistic idea, because all I am now is what I'm thinking about my thinking. And I've reduced myself. What's the thing in philosophy? Reductio absurdum, reduced to the absurd. I've reduced my entire experience to only what I think and wonder why I feel alone, separate, not belonging, low self-esteem, less than. All of those feelings come from feeling the thoughts I'm having, not reality and truth. But I'm imagining them as reality and truth because I think my thinking is my reality and truth, which is what people tend to say when they justify what they're thinking against someone else's thinking and say, well, that's my reality. That's my truth. Truth in absolute terms can't be mine, but it can be ours. And it can't be ours if it isn't all things too, all that is and all that are. So thinking in those terms is pretty expansive because you begin to realize that contemplating omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence and all of these all-inclusive concepts, when contemplated accurately and honestly, doesn't leave a lot of room for obsessive thoughts to wander around. It starts to demystify, literally, the misty, foggy notions of that seeming lack of clarity, that cloudiness, that ghostliness that seems to haunt us. And historically, that's been religion and gods that have been talked about as humans who are pissed off because we don't behave often. And I would say that is the ego we've been worshiping and thinking of as God in human image, rather than our spirit is in the likeness and image of that spirit, of that power that's absolute in all respects. So history has shown that we have been wrong about many, many things. And almost consistently, when those wrongs were righted, there's been a great shift in human awareness in terms of our capacity to begin to function on a level that's much more effective. It also gave us a sense of greater prowess many times. And so we felt we had the right to dominate nature and dominate things that would become poison and contemptful and corrupt in relation to those things. And we doing that in our own experience, if things go well, we think, okay, that proves we're right. We're better. But it doesn't seem like they ever go well enough to ever think how well they've gone is enough to survive the moment. Seems like they need to go a little more well and a little more well and a little better, a little better, a little better. I've never worked with anybody that isn't trying to feel better. And not noticing that not feeling what they're doing obviously isn't getting better at feeling. It's getting better at trying not to feel what's happening and trying to deny that and not take advantage, of those dramatic impacts that we create. And say, wow, this is a very clear owner's manual to my human experience. If I'm listening clearly, if I'm looking clearly, if I'm observing clearly, I'm seeing that I'm being given all the information I need to unravel the ideas I have that are not true, that I think are true. Mission accomplished.
Done and done.
Well, now with that, what of it? So what is actually a question. We normally turn it into dismissing somebody's thinking. But it's really, okay, so what? What do we do with that? How do we operate on that basis? What does that mean in daily terms and confronting circumstances and situations rather than feeling condemned by circumstances and situations, starting to notice that we're actually the creators of those circumstances and situations. So what?
My first sponsor, who was great, she would often say, "So what? Who cares?" When she was a badass. And when I had a problem, she would be like, "So what? Who cares?" And I would always be like, "Oh yeah, you're right." Like I would make such a mountain out of a molehill. And then when she said, "So what? Who cares?" it really calmed me down.
Yeah.
It really worked.
And the big question, Jackie, is why is it that we're doing that disproportionate thing? It isn't, the thing that you're doing in the moment you're doing it is no more than the doing you're doing, right?
Right.
To observe that, like she's saying, so what? She's dismissing it, saying, okay, so what? It's a delusion. What is it to you? It's an illusion. How much do you want to make out of it? Well,
Right.
our investment in it is making believe it's going to be true someday. Someday we're going to prove that who we are is what we think, and we're going to keep making investments in these little thoughts, hoping they're going to turn into something. We're going to molehill into a mountain and think that the mountain we've made, which is a dramatic impact on our experience, and becomes this all-consuming preoccupation that seems to include every conversation we have with everyone in some way, trying to get their allegiance to support this. When in fact, it's nothing more than a thought. But the question is, in this conversation, why is it? What is the predetermined state that we're basing our existence on that we don't even think of? We're willing to correct the wrong and notice it's an illusion. But the question is, why do we keep repeating it in any way? Why would that continue in some way where we get used to just saying, so what? What does it matter? And dismiss it and not notice that we're not really dismissing it because it continues to recur. Just like the idea that I'm never going to have a drink again at 2:00 in the morning because I'm ready to pass out and I'm sick and I'm throwing up, and that's great then. But by 10:00 the next day, 6 p.m. the next day, I'm ready to go again. I don't have the same experience. It's not as bad as it was in those moments that I was swearing it off. So the issue hasn't really been addressed. It's been topically. Treating effects seems to be the tendency of addiction, trying to stop it all the time rather than notice that we're the starters of it and start to concede that we were the ones that had the thought that we could drink and use. We could drink and enjoy and control our drinking was the basic thought of every alcoholic or drug addict who continued. Long as I had that. Yeah.
Oh, for me, I never wanted to control and enjoy my drinking.
Right.
That helped me get sober because I was like, if I can't drink like a wild maniac, I don't want to drink.
Right.
So
more was never enough.
More was never enough. Yeah.
Right. So in relation to the so what and the dismissing of the experience, It's never going to be enough to do that, because if it keeps recurring, it's not being treated as a cause, it's being treated as an effect. And that in mental health is the idea that we can think we're not doing what we're doing while we're doing what we're doing in terms of thought. We have that possibility. I wouldn't say it's the most accurate approach. It's accurate to the degree that it does what it does, but what it does is give us impressions that are wrong, that become depressing as we rely on them longer and longer, because the pressure builds, and any pressure creates depressions. It creates impressions, it creates depressions in time. How much of that depression do we want before we say, oh, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to stop. But the stopping comes from admitting that we're the starters of it. We're the ones lighting the fire, and we keep trying to put it out.
We
So to
didn't
see,
start the fire. It was always burning. Okay.
so if we're doing that, what would compel us to continue?
Because we don't have tools to, well, we have them now, but I'm saying what compelled me to keep doing it in the past before all my beautiful tools.
But let's
was
talk before you had the tools.
right. I was compelled because it was because I did think I had, there were different reasons I drank. One is because something went wrong, and in my opinion, I perceived something as going wrong, and the other was to blow off steam, to have fun.
Mm-hmm.
But they were always with consequences. Well, towards the end, they had consequences.
I would say they always were. They just weren't significant enough to get your attention. And my sense
Right.
is the worse we get, it's really a cry for help as we're getting worse. And we're saying, I'm going to act like I have no idea what I'm doing. So I'm going to cry for help. And when no one responds, I'm going to feel being alone is true. It's right. It's correct.
Right.
So my sense is what is compelling it is we think it's right at the time. We really believe it's right. And to believe wrong is right creates an impossible impasse in our mental health. So in thinking of it today, with the thinking we do and the obsession we have, thinking we're not doing it because we've done all these other things to get better and we feel better, and we don't have all of the attributes we did when we were at our worst point, when we finally said, I can't take it anymore. We think not being at that worst point means it's no longer happening, and yet we're still subtly nursing ourselves in some way to try to feel better about what's going on, because we feel depressed and we feel unwanted and we feel displaced and we feel conflicted and we feel turmoil and anguish. And those are all indications this thing is still going on while we're thinking it isn't. The clarity is saying, wow, if I'm on it, when I was in college, in a psychology class, the teacher said that there were some people born with the inability to feel like what's wrong. They couldn't feel pain. And almost none of them lived past their teens because they had no way of noticing. If they cut themselves, they wouldn't know it. They just wouldn't pay attention to it. They'd be bleeding out. If they had a stomach problem, they wouldn't know it, wouldn't feel it, wouldn't occur to them. If that's a condition you can be born with, and yet it's not a condition that you and I were born with and we're creating to desensitize ourselves to the awareness of our awareness, we're on a hell-bent path to try and make believe that we can control ideas that are literally out of control because they have no basis in reality whatsoever. So the idea of out of control here, like the idea of powerless in the first step, powerless isn't I have less power. It's I have no power whatsoever, because the idea I had no power, because a lie has absolutely no power, which is why they constantly need to be reinforced. So they don't live on their own. They have no life of their own. They're reinforced by thinkers thinking it's the right thing to do, the right thing to say, the right thing to think. And it's depressing to live that way, naturally. So if we can do it in the present and start noticing that we're thinking things we don't even think we're thinking, because we've become so habitualized to the impacts that we've learned to become numb to them, then we're constantly in this teeter-totter trying to grow in our desensitized state, becoming less sensitive to what's actually happening and thinking that that's actually progress, rather than seeing that it's very demoralizing because it's immoral, it's not honest, it's not true, it's not responsible. Doesn't mean we're not responsible for it. It means we're responsible for the irresponsibility. Irresponsibility doesn't happen naturally. It happens as a choice that's contrary to nature. Just like victimhood and all those kinds of things, they're all coming out of choosing our seeming reality. They don't exist out there in the world. There's no victims in actual reality or truth, which actually is the reality and truth we all live with and experience and are naturally not bound by, but freed by. Free to do these ridiculous things and think they're the right thing in this tiny little microcosmic world that we seem to live in and create. It's never going to be true. The book says somewhere that we suffer from a lack of proportion. Why? We increase things that mean nothing and we decrease things that mean everything. If we're capable of that and addicted to the idea that we're the creators of reality, that's the way we go to extremes to try and prove we're right, while we're constantly backing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, swimming this mood swing back and forth, constantly trying to stay still while we're creating the movement. Ultimately and presently, if this is looked at honestly, the beauty of the system becomes obvious, because it becomes obvious that we're trying to mystify the system by claiming we have nothing to do with what we're doing. So this is sort of a demystification and saying, we obviously know what we're doing. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't know what we were doing. We can say whatever we want, we can think whatever we want, and that includes thinking we have absolutely nothing to do with it, and it's just a state of life. Animals don't seem to be struggling with the depression, except, by the way, domesticated animals. They're actually given drugs to manage their moods. How convenient for us to have created that. We lost you for a minute, Jackie.
I'm home, so I switched to my computer.
So if we know, if there's an absolute knowing nature, and that would be primary, that would not be an option, it would not be negotiable, it would be primary. Essence would be essence, and it would be essential, and it would be the nature of nature for all of us, all things, all that are and all that is, everything, and all things that aren't even things. Essence is like the essence, that wouldn't be a thing, it would just be a state of being, a present absolute knowing awareness. That isn't a thing because it isn't filled with things, because it isn't in pieces. It doesn't come in parts. It isn't observed the way that we observe our experience, in our human experience. And yet to think of all things simultaneously is to begin to see the absolute nature of everything. rather than look at them in parts and pieces and think we're going to figure them out individually. Start looking at them collectively, and you start to see that we actually have a common nature in humanity. Just like nature has a common nature that's been serving us as long as humans have been on this planet.
I just found out that Rumi, I love reading his quotes and poems. And I found out, I thought he was born in like 1911 or something like that, but he was born in 1207.
1200. Yeah.
1207.
Yeah.
Like this stuff has been around for so long. Why? Like it should be the first thing we're taught in school. We should learn it before ABC.
But if we think of the sickness, if we know, if that knowledge is not disputable and not optional, then we know it, and we're waiting for somebody else to tell us.
Right.
Think of that. Think of that.
Well, we're really learning not to know the truth.
Well, we think we're learning not to know it, but the knowing of it can't be unlearned. It has us. We don't have it.
Okay.
It's different because if it's the essence, then it's just the essence. And if it's all we know, and we've known it all along, this feeds right into the idea that no one who recovers from alcohol or drug addiction or any addiction recovers because somebody else tells them they have an addiction. They recover because they admit their own state, their own addiction. They become what's called self-diagnosed, meaning they're diagnosing their own condition. And it's impossible to help anyone before they get to that point of wanting help, because the natural transition of beginning to notice I have a problem, conceding that problem, is realizing that there's all kinds of help available. The idea that I don't have a problem creates the impression that there's no help available and I'm helpless. Not only helpless, I'm hopeless, and I'm completely worthless, and I'm useless, and I have no purpose here whatsoever. I'm just going to kill myself. That thinking is very popular today for suicide to be at an all-time high. Now, obviously, in a population that's growing bigger, the number of people would naturally grow, but I believe it's also a percentage of the population also growing, which signifies that something is wrong enough to allow that to continue to fester without any significant enough resolution to start to actually minimize or address it. It's not being thought of correctly. It's being thought of as something to try to stop, try to get people to feel better, try to give them drugs to have them not feel what they're feeling and think that feeling better is going to help. It's exactly what drug addiction's about to begin with. So if we know, then we know, period. And we've always known it. And I would suggest that the depression, gave back to the previous point, the depression we feel, the sadness we feel, the grief we feel, the mourning we feel, is our awareness of that knowledge. If we didn't have that knowledge, we would not be aware of feeling like we didn't belong, when in fact we're feeling the thinking we're doing that has no place, and translating that into, again, disproportionately, life. We have no place in life. We have no place on earth. You couldn't consider not having a place if you didn't have a place to consider that from. Be impossible to ever consider you don't belong if you didn't belong where you were when you thought that. But think of the blindness that goes into that thinking. Don't notice the obvious, but be absolutely sure of everything that's completely mysterious. Seems to be completely beyond my comprehension. It's a backward approach.
I have several people in my life who are they're not drinking, but they're not going to any type of recovery program.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have tools, but a majority of them don't. And they will say things that are intended. I don't know if they'll just say, well, I don't need AA. And it all goes back to, in my defenselessness, my safety lies. there's a part of me that wants to argue for how great AA is. And
Mhm.
but I know that is not what gets them to go. And they might not ever go. It's not my issue. But for me, I love it. I love my recovery. I love everything about it. I didn't love it right away. It took me a really long time to realize the shoe wasn't going to drop. I kept being like, the shoe's going to drop. And I thought it was a cult. I thought it was religion. I had all these preconceived notions. But once I realized the shoe wasn't dropping, I just was ecstatic and I've just loved it. And anyway, so I have to, there's all different ways to look at it, but now I'm dealing with the people in my life that are refuse to go to AA. I can laugh in my head at their stubbornness. It's sometimes it's a little difficult because, or I can perceive it as difficult because their lack of the tools affects me. And yeah, but I can also look at it as funny. It's interesting how I can't just be like regular with it. It's either really funny to me or it's like I feel like they're trying to shame me and I get defensive.
Yeah. So
But I like thinking that it's funny. It's funny. It's
well,
funny.
you're a comedian, so that helps to at least give you some material. But notice the extremes there, Jackie. It's either funny or it's really demoralizing.
Yeah.
So Matt, see that range is always possible, right? From positions we take, it's always possible to go to the extremes.
Right.
And or be anywhere in between. The neutrality is about noticing that neutrality is the freedom. It isn't saying that we can't be affected, we shouldn't be affected, but when we are affected, we're not taking a neutral stance. We're taking a position in favor or against. And I would suggest your friends don't need it. Nobody needs AA. Nobody needs it. And it's for people that want it because they've come to terms and they want something. And my sense is the idea that need automatically has us, if we're not breathing, we'll automatically try to breathe. If we're drowning, we'll automatically try to get to the surface. There's not a lot of discussion going on in that kind of thing. So one of, I think, the great failures in modern sobriety is that we're trying to caretake for people that aren't interested. And what we're doing is giving them the impression that their position is worth defending because they now have someone opposing them. And now they feel more righteous about that decision. Rather than really experience the demoral, when somebody gets to a point like you did, where they're really witnessing what they're doing honestly, they're naturally going to notice that there's a lot of help for them. And there's a lot of people that may have ideas that are better than the ones they're nursing. It doesn't seem to ever happen because somebody tells them. It's because they finally witness their own experience. And sometimes, just like the book says, you want to go out and drink? You think you can? Our hats are off to you. Tell us how it goes. There's freedom in that.
Right, absolutely.
And we've been enabling people and thinking that we need to nurse them into recovery and nurse them to maintain their recovery, while we're actually taking their dignity away from noticing that it's up to them and they have the absolute, not only right, they have the capacity to get better, always. The fact that they're delusional about it isn't my business, and it's not your business in terms of changing it, but we can certainly notice it and observe it, and we can share our own experience and say, look, for as long as I thought that way, I continued to use, I continued to struggle, I continued to find myself thinking in these gaps were better, but all of a sudden one day there was a thought I had that would have been insane 2 days before, that all of a sudden it makes perfect sense, and I'm back out drinking again, I'm back out fooling around in some way. We all have compulsions that are attached to obsessive thoughts. Every obsessive thought has a compulsion. We're all still acting compulsively to any degree we maintain those thoughts that are obsessive. Each of us. And you can see, Jackie, your defensiveness to your position, thinking of it as what they're doing when you're the one that's hammering the stake into the ground, which can be very, very disturbing to notice.
Right. But for the most part, I'm neutral about it. I'm pretty, because of the program, I'm able to do it.
But let's say real quick while you're on that point, rather than feign neutrality, begin to embrace the parts that aren't neutral. Begin to notice that those things you've been doing that you don't think you're doing, we can talk our way out of it, and we can feel better, and we can manipulate our way into one direction or another and say we're neutral, but yet they still gnaw on us in some way.
Right.
And my sense is the real freedom, that knowing is like a professor who's saying, look, I gave you the book. I show up at class. You don't show up and you can't pass the class. So you keep coming back to take the class over to pass because you're not listening. You're not taking the textbook that's being given you with all the curriculum you need. You're ignoring it, thinking you can overwhelm it and overcome it by that sense of power you have in your thinking to deny things and make believe they're not there. Rather than say, wow, if I keep doing this, maybe there's a part of me it's doing something I don't even think I'm doing. I think I've talked my way out of. Rather than say, you know what? That knowing thing that constantly comes up in some new way at some time is actually my commitment to ignoring what I'm actually doing. And ignorance is always going to come out of that. The thinking that comes out of that's always going to be corrupt in some way.
I feel like you've already answered this, but I want to ask one question.
Sure.
So, surprise, surprise, one of the people is my mother. And surprise, surprise.
I think we've had that conversation.
Surprise, surprise. So it is beautiful. I never thought I would have both my parents. I grew up with both of them being alcoholics, and I'm the only child of them. And we grew up away from my extended family. So it was just me and them in this all alone, and they were drinking.
Right.
But I'm 7.5 years sober, and my mom has not had a drink in 2.5 years. So my sobriety inspired her, which was beautiful. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm so, so grateful for that. And she'll bring up all the time, I don't need sobriety. I just stopped drinking. But meanwhile, and I can laugh, like I said, and at the same time, I feel guilty that she's all alone. And part of why she's all alone is, I mean, she didn't listen to anything I said. I told her not to move where she moved. I did everything to try to get her to not end up alone where she is. And so I don't have to feel guilty, but if she would just go to AA, she wouldn't be so lonely. But I feel guilty that she's so lonely, but she won't do anything to help it. But I don't want to feel guilty about it anymore when it's not my fault.
Well, you're feeling guilty because you're guilty.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So if you think you know better if she knows what she knows and you know that she knows what she knows, and give her that freedom to know what she knows because you have the freedom to know what you know, right?
Right.
You're thinking she needs you and you have something she doesn't have. That would be a faulty thought in terms of the absolute nature of existence. Follow me?
Yeah.
If there's an absolute state of knowing, we all have it. And this was exactly what I was starting to address with this idea that we're enabling people by making believe that we have something they don't have and what they need is what we have. And that they don't have what we have.
She wants to be around me more, and she wants to talk on the phone more.
Yeah. But if you're nursing a grudge over how she's behaving, those times you'll spend with her are going to be very difficult because you have an idea of how she should be, what she should be doing, how she should be doing it, and they're not living up to your ideas. When that's worked for you, but that moment, Jackie, that you came to terms with that, you came to terms with that alone and said, this isn't working. I'm gonna do something here to change this. I'm going to be the one. Nobody did it for you. Nobody came in and said, you're completely incapable of fending for yourself, and we're going to take over for you, and we're going to send you to a meeting, and you're going to get better. Because when you went to those meetings, they would also be saying, you know what, you're not sitting in the right chair, you're not sitting up, you're not listening, you don't look like you're listening, you should be listening to this, and you should not be eating that and having this, and not all that stuff would become someone else's opinion, which would be very confounding to someone having their own experience, because we each have our own experience. We each know we know, and if we do and have that, we know too that would be absolutely the case for everyone else. And again, that point that Bill made in the book, you want to drink? Go out, drink. Tell us how it goes. He's really opening the door of freedom to allowing people to have their own experience. Al-Anon was developed specifically because Lois began to realize that she had been helping Bill drink by being antagonistic to what he was doing and thinking she knew better what he should be doing, when in fact she was struggling with the exact same mental illness he had in relation to the drinking. She thought her control and her rightness and her ideas were the thing he needed, when in fact it was giving him all the ammunition he needed to continue and to go over and over and over and repeat it over and over again. He used her as his excuse. And Al-Anon's about taking that all apart and saying we're all in relationships and we're all relating already. Nobody's alone.
Right.
We can isolate and sort of push ourselves off to the side, but it sounds to me that she's happier to be in touch with you now because she has a level of appreciation that's changed dramatically. But you're still antagonized by it.
I think I'm getting it. Like it's kind of arrogant for me to think that, for me to feel guilty is an arrogance that she needs me. I can allow her to not need me in that way.
Well, in essence, you are her daughter. Nobody lived inside of her but you her whole life. You guys have an amazing connection, right? But I would say that your guilt is actually an accurate assessment of the guilt for what you're doing. We don't feel guilt because we're innocent. We feel guilt. Few people say, I'm really suffering from feeling innocent.
I want to suffer from feeling innocent.
But think about it. You wouldn't, because you won't, because innocence is our nature.
I feel innocent.
So let's go back to the guilt. When you're feeling guilty, you know, irresponsibility is a choice. Responsibility isn't a choice. It's just it's the nature of nature. So the stability of responsibility and absolute principles is that they're stable. They don't change. We change in our thinking. And when our thinking changes and we think all of a sudden other people are irresponsible for not doing what we think they should, that's something we're causing. It's not something they're doing. Because once we see what we're doing, what they do is what they do. They're just doing what they're doing. They're not attacking us. They're not threatening us, because we don't have a stake in the ground. We don't have an investment in that thought. So the conflicts always indicate something. We're first and foremost what we're doing with what's happening, not with what's happening. And if it is an emergency that's so compelling, your instincts will take over and you'll know exactly what to do. And you're certainly not going to stand around wondering about whether or not you should get out of the way of the oncoming train.
Right.
You're going to do, unless you're intent on killing yourself, you're going to do everything you can without even thinking about it, which shows that we have an awareness that's built into our system to deal with actual emergencies, but we've been creating emergencies and making believe that somehow we will have that same accuracy and opinion while we're reversing our whole instinctive nature by conflicting with what's happening as though it should only be what we think of it rather than what's actually happening. Your mom, I can guarantee you one thing. If you just build this into your thinking, your mom's always going to do what she does. Just like you're always going to do what you do, and I'm always going to do what I do, and everyone's always going to do what they do. Whatever that is, always. I'm always thinking what I'm thinking. When I come to terms with that, I begin to say, yeah, okay, if that's the case, then the impacts of that thinking are going to be the things I feel, primarily. Doesn't mean they're real. It doesn't mean they're true. It means that I am imposing them, I'm inducing them and imposing them on my experience. The book says self-induced, self-imposed. I would say if the self that's imposing and inducing those things is imagined, the self is an imposition and an inducement of thought, nothing more. It's just what we think we are. And as a result, when you're attached to the idea that your thinking is right because your thinking is real, you're going to feel your life is threatened by what other people do. Your mother being one of those people, just like your other friends. You're antagonized because you feel it literally threatens you, when in fact the threat is created in your thinking because you're imagining it to be what it isn't, which is reality and truth. Reality and truth doesn't need your thinking. As evidenced by everyone who's died, it doesn't need anyone's thinking because it seems to remain even when people are gone, when they're no longer thinking. The knowingness seems to be the same, seems to remain. It was probably here before we arrived.
I like it. Thank you.
It's an observation, which is a consideration, which is considerate, just to begin to notice it and notice what look at the words that you're using to define your experience, Jackie, and think of them as accurate to the experience. You know how they say feelings aren't facts?
Yes.
They may not be facts because the thinking that's associated to them are not facts. But if I'm feeling guilty, I know that I'm aware I've been convicted literally by my own awareness, knowing I'm doing the thing that I'm experiencing. I'm guilty for this, the cause of this conflict. The conflict doesn't exist until I start it. What your mother thinks is not something that's ever bothered me. I don't have an opinion about it.
That's really funny.
I never even met her. I met her through you. But
that was really funny.
At the same time, the people closer to me, I have those ideas about. I do have ideas about what people should and shouldn't be doing. So those are my opportunities to notice the impact I'm having on my environment and also the deteriorative impact it can have on relationships, because people get tired of that after a while. They're already sick and tired of their own thinking. They don't need my conflicted thinking on top of that. It's not an icing on the cake. It's just a completely stagnant, stale, putrid foundation for a relationship. And it gets rotten over time. So those are my if I didn't know better, and I suspect this would go for everyone, we wouldn't know so clearly what's wrong. And to begin to see the wrong as the thing we're doing to start with is to begin to clearly see the wrong other people are suffering from. But rather than hold them in contempt for the wrong they're suffering from, you will see them with compassion, because you will know that you were doing the exact same thing and you knew exactly what that suffering means. You knew it then, you know it now. You have the same compassion we do for other people who are drinking. We know that they could be better. We know they're not always interested in being better. And it's sad because I've had 40 some people in my life overdose or kill themselves.
Jesus.
Yeah. So there's a sadness to that, a futility in thinking I said everything I knew I could and it didn't matter.
Right.
Because ultimately the one thing we're not nursing is the idea that we each have the right to think whatever we want, and it doesn't make what we think right. And to begin to give people that latitude, you know, people say the worst enemy is the enemy within.
Yes.
There's no better potential for surrender than coming to terms with the fact that you were the one creating it, that it's internal, it's not external. It's not you and your mom. Your mom's actually giving you, from my vantage point, she's giving you clues of a sense of appreciation for you that she probably didn't have 2 years ago, and a thankfulness. My father also stopped drinking when he was 70. How old was your mom when she stopped?
72.
Yeah. Around 70, he started talking about his war experiences, and he started crying every time he did.
Oh, wow.
His whole life, he tried to deny it, tried to think it was the right thing to do, the patriotic thing, the loyal thing, but it wore on him. And when he finally turned 70, he had enough experience to start to notice might be worth mentioning. But he also saw my experience and he said, I realized that I always thought drinking was glamorous. And I realize now it's the decision I made that always caused the problems I suffered from and had.
That's great
And
awareness.
and he just stopped.
So
He
he
didn't
didn't
go to a program
either.
drinking. He just never drank again.
Oh, wow. That's the same as my mother. That's
Yeah.
interesting. We have that coincidence, and both our names are Jack.
So was his.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So in that appreciation, I never pushed it with him. He just knew that something happened.
Right.
And he knew that something happened that he couldn't make sense out of, because I had him in tears when I was 14, because he just didn't know what to do with me. He just was he loved me. He wanted everything to be good for me. And he kept seeing me make mistakes that were just absurdly ridiculous and insane and dangerous. And he was upset, but his upset was at a depth well beyond the experience he was having with me. And my sense is that while we can narrow in on what we think is the reason we're feeling what we're thinking, we're feeling what we're feeling, generally the reason is much more profound than the circumstances we're assigning to it, because it's central to the experience that we're creating. And to be engulfed and intoxicated and consumed with our own inability to come to terms with what we're doing wreaks havoc in the decision-making process that we have about what other people are doing. We're in conflict with them rather than saying, oh, she's doing exactly what I did for as long as I made believe that somehow I could do it alone, and that I was alone, and that there was no help. She's doing the exact same thing. I can relate to that. I know when I thought those things, I thought I was right. I know until that point I realized maybe I'm wrong. Those things seem to be real, seem to be true, but I'm still doing it. To any degree I find those conflicts, I still know that there's ideas I have that are cultural, that seem to be baked into my system so deeply I can't get to, and yet they're giving me the impression every day they're there. And it's a matter of how willing I am to begin to embrace them and begin to say, oh, here it is again. Here's this seeming dilemma I have. How willing am I right now to be honest about the fact that I don't feel good about this situation? And it's not the situation, it's the not feeling good about it that I'm really struggling with. If the situation's the situation, it's the situation. I'm not going to make it better by getting worse.
Thank you.
And going to Gabe again, Gabe, with the talk we had, is that this is ultimately the practice and the exercise as you described it, Jackie. When you get a toolkit, you can all of a sudden fix doorknobs and take tires off of flat tires. If you don't have the tools, you're never going to do it with your hand. But ultimately, we know, we have a knowing source that is so clear about what we're doing, that is clarified in the clarity we have of what's wrong. And to think of that wrong as being something we don't have anything to do with is another wrong that perpetuates the idea that there's nothing we can do about it. And that's exactly the addictive mental state that I find myself in 37 years into sobriety, whenever I'm nursing those thoughts. So whenever I'm feeling the conflict, whenever I'm finding somebody else to blame, it doesn't mean I have to like what they're doing. But if I don't come to terms with how overwhelmingly disliking it can become in my own experience, I'm really not growing. I'm really not applying principles. I'm reapplying the old ideas I have about my thinking being reality. And somehow if I'm more morose about it and more moody about it and more upset about it, it's going to somehow miraculously come true and be better, and I'm going to be proven right. It's never happened. Never happened. Never going to happen.
I have another question.
Fire.
A friend of mine is in NA,
Yeah.
and she is a secretary of a meeting, and she asked me to speak. So I said yes. And I'm alcohol was really my problem. I did do drugs. I know what I'm going to do. I know what I'm going to talk about, but I have a nagging feeling that I think it's all going to go great, and it's going to be healing for me even to be able to talk about the drugs that I did, because I don't talk to them about them in AA. But I'm concerned that I'm going to say sober instead of clean, and it feels kind of like a lie to say I'm Jackie, I'm an addict. But I was an alcohol addict, and I am a little bit of a coffee addict right now. So it's not really a lie.
Yeah. And
I
keep in
think-
mind,
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
You're an addict, Jackie, full on. Don't even question that. I mean,
Okay,
we all are. We
Thank-
all are. And I mean, I wouldn't even question, that would be the least of my worries. And by the by, you're so articulate and fun. I wouldn't even fret at all. They're lucky to have you.
Thank you.
And you know, all those people, the NA meetings that I ever went to in Malibu, all they talked about was doing blow and stuff. And I just wanted to go get some after. It was crazy. Those meetings are scary. It's
but
true.
keep in mind, Jackie's mentioning this because she's experiencing this. And regardless of the ways that we might suggest she get over it, the having of it is an awareness that you would like to do the right thing, and you're going to be in a group of people who may not think of you as doing the right thing.
Right.
And I can assure you, whenever you're with people, they're thinking about something you're not doing that's right. So get used to that.
That's a given.
Yeah. So, but the bigger issue, Jackie, in my experience, and again, why we have this conversation and why I could be somewhat of a pariah even within AA because of my persistent discussion. The disease is mental, and it's shared by all compulsive symptomatic programs. Every one of the 150 or 200 programs is based in a mental obsession. Every one of them.
Right.
So it's interesting that we struggle over symptoms and how we address them, when in fact the real struggle is always mental, and yet we talk more about the symptom and think that's our identifying feature, when the one thing we have in common with the entire species of humans is this mental potential problem that we are all capable of manufacturing by making believe that a thought we have happens to be true simply because we conclude it's true, rather than leave a little bit of room at the edge to say, well, I think it's true right now, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I'll weigh it against experience and see how it goes, which is a much more adaptable approach to living than thinking it's true, that's the end of it, and I'm just going to live with it, and come hell or high water, I'm going to fight for it, and it's going to identify me and all that kind of stuff. It's nonsense.
Thank you.
So I think the mental, emotional sobriety is living sober. Recovery is thinking, is recovering from a physical ailment that's killing us. It's not sane to continue to act compulsively, because there's no compulsion that we can act on that is healthy. None of them, ever. They're always a form of trying to kill ourselves, because the self we think we are, we're afraid of dying, which is all born in thought. We're so afraid of letting go of the thinking about the thinking. Hang on. Here's Katie Bird.
We're leaving.
The whole idea that thinking about thinking is ourself is based in fear, because it isn't true, and we know that it's not true. We wouldn't be afraid, we wouldn't have this seeming self-centered fear if we didn't know that what we're doing was wrong. If we really didn't know it, it wouldn't have any impact on us whatsoever. The impact that it has never seems to come with bliss and happiness. It always seems to come with a demoralized, incomprehensibly demoralized state, mental state of depression, inner conflict, emotional turmoil, mental anguish, anxiety, stress, struggle, pressure, all of those, reactiveness, impulsiveness, and compulsions. It's all bound up in something we make up. We make up our mind and think of it as inflexible. And the attachment we have to those thoughts being right is the reason we have these antagonistic relationships with other people. We really believe they're wrong because we're so right about what we're doing. I've never been righteous and right simultaneously, because the fact is, if I was right, I wouldn't fight for it. I would just be acting on it, and it would be so obvious, because 2 + 2 has always been 4. Everybody can pretty much go with that. Right? If I'm dealing with people who think it's 5 and they say, oh, it's 4. Oh, now that helps. No wonder I've been having a problem in math. So that sanity is coming from the mental side. And I think you, at 7.5 years, have obviously worked with enough people to see the bonus and benefits of helping, but also realizing the 12 steps says we try to carry the message, meaning it's ultimately up to the individual to come to terms with what they're doing, because they're the ones doing what they're doing, just like you're the one doing what you're doing and I'm the one doing what I'm doing. We can speak in absolute terms, but for me to tell you what you should be doing would be for me to presume you have no idea other than mine. And that would be an invasive, contemptful approach to living. Wouldn't be emotionally sober. It would be, again, dictatorial, authoritarian, demanding, insisting, fighting everything and everyone. Soive.
Mm-hmm.
So noticing it is, this was, I think, part of Gabe's. My sense is to begin to look at this honestly is a little depressing, because you're looking at depression.
Right.
Actually beginning to notice the awareness we have to acknowledge things as they are, and to think because we're looking clearer, to think because my glasses are foggy or my windshield's covered that the weather's sunny, and end up turning the windshield wipers on and finding out it's raining. It was raining to begin with. It was my own delusion that gave me the impression it wasn't raining, because I was using this foggy idea I have about things as reality. So to become aware of it is actually to say, oh, I mean, I had a panic attack when I first saw this. My whole body turned gray because I realized I'd been creating this fear my whole life. I'd been filling my thoughts with these ideas that were just had contaminated my body. I had tension through my whole body that released, as though the fear, like a volcano, finally let go of all that pressure. And it was, if I was overwhelmed with the little bits I thought I was managing every day, imagine all of a sudden experiencing it in full volume. It felt a little overwhelming, but I knew accurately and intuitively exactly what was happening. And I'm not suggesting that is necessary any more than Bill suggested you had to have that white light experience spiritually. Everybody, it comes to us each in the way it comes to us. But the honesty in looking is seeing, if I'm looking at something disturbing as disturbing, I'm aligning it. I'm not creating conflict here. I'm beginning to align it and say, oh, it's disturbing. Doesn't mean that my thought isn't the thing creating the disturbance. But if that's what I'm doing is a manifestation of thinking, then the effect I'm feeling is simply coming from the thought. If I begin to acknowledge it and I'm honest about it, it will dissipate, because there is nothing remains in space. Once something starts moving in space, it'll continue moving forever unless it's acted on by an opposing force. And for me to think a delusion is reality, the opposing force is the thought I'm having that it's still real. I'm creating a sense of opposition in my own experience by imagining something that I'm simply thinking becomes reality. The idea that it's real isn't the thing I'm thinking about. It's the thinking I'm doing about the thing I'm thinking about in the present right now. That's what gives me that sense of guilt and pressure and depression and all that. And to not think of it as something I'm doing, I all of a sudden think I'm depressed and it's impossible to get over, because I'm not conceding that I'm actually creating the depression by creating a weightiness of matter that doesn't even exist. It's like a dream, and I think I'm being chased by a tiger that really doesn't exist, except within the confines of the thinking I'm doing, the experience I'm having, that's all a dream. It's the same thing that we're doing. We're sleepwalking in this regard, daydreaming.
Tiger in the bush. Rawr.
You know what I hear a lot when I speak, and I don't try to. I have the same feelings you were talking about, though. I always feel a little awkward because I know I'm not going to do the standard MO.
Yeah.
Like there's kind of a cultural routine that people do, and they're generally funny, and it's kind of hand slapping and or handshaking and back slapping and all that stuff. And I don't tend to do that. I don't tend to have a canned pitch, but I do address the mental issues. But almost inevitably, somebody will say, I seem to know that what you're saying is right, but I don't understand it. Now think of that.
Right.
Think of the clarity of being able to admit that the person knows they know, and yet they're struggling with understanding. And what's interesting about that is that understanding, when I think reality is my thinking, my understanding of reality now is actually misunderstanding. It's not understanding at all. I think misunderstanding now becomes my reality, but I call it understanding. And people say in sobriety that addiction is a product of perception. It's a disease of perception. It's not the case. It's a disease of misperception. Perception accurately would not cause a conflict. It wouldn't cause depression. It would just simply assess what's happening as it's happening. So we get it backward and then wonder why everything seems confusing and life seems hard and different. Life isn't hard or complicated. It's so simple as to be doing what it's been doing the entire time. And the only thing we struggle with is trying to figure out what it's doing. Well, it's already doing what it's doing. We don't need to figure out any more than that. If we're going to have an understanding and think in absolute terms, it's very simple to resolve that reality's reality, and everything that's happening is happening as a result of reality. That's it. Period. Over. Done. We've just considered everything. It's a lot different meditative contemplation to consider things in absolute terms than to try to think the bits and pieces that we carve out and think need to be resolved will ever be resolved. There's no resolution in that. There's no emotional sobriety in that. Trying to patch things up and continue doing the thing that's creating the leaks is not fixing the boat. Patching a tire and putting a nail in it at the same time would be insane. And we're doing that exact same thing in the thinking, constantly trying to feel better about it. Get over it. Well, I'm thinking this, but I really can do this, so I'm just going to think I'm doing that rather than this. And we're just creating sort of a hailstorm in our own thoughts. Can we do it? Absolutely. Are we free to do it? Absolutely. Do we have the right to do it? Absolutely. Doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it feels free. We feel condemned because we're thinking things that are contemptful. And we think they're right. That's where the contempt comes from. Thinking wrong is easy. I do it all the time. Thinking it's right takes effort because it'll never be right. But seeing it as wrong allows me the chance to adjust and begin to correct. So we can right wrongs, which is, in my estimation, exactly what the 12 steps are designed to help us learn to do. It's not about acting right. It's about righting wrongs. And I do enough of it every day. I got a lot of practice. You get a lot of material from me if you hung out more. Which I'd like to do, by the way.
Give me material.
Well, hang out a little more and then you can take it all.
Yeah, let's do it.
You get all the material.
Okay.
So talking about this is not something anyone needs to understand in terms of all the details and all this stuff. If you start to notice your thoughts race, that you feel sort of depressed, that you feel all this stuff, just notice that even in the consideration of something that could be correct, and I don't say that it is because my words are not ever going to accommodate the essence of essence, but your understanding can and your knowing does. It's already there. It's already in that way. It isn't my words. I'm not here to become dependable in that regard. I want to make it clear as I can that we each have that all things have that. Trees know what to do and they don't fight over what they're doing. Humans do that. We've chosen to become Because we can think about our thinking, we've chosen to create all these dilemmas that we face and think of them as insurmountable while we're unwilling to mount the sermon that we're actually creating. We're unwilling to actually come to terms with this sort of perpetuation of story that we develop around the impossibility of stopping what we're doing. Because we're not looking at being the creators of it. We think of it as something that should stop and not notice we're the ones that keep restarting it. If we know, it would be worth mentioning. And as you begin to consider that, you'll start noticing that your clarity is that you start realizing what you're doing while you're doing it rather than thinking of it as something you shouldn't be doing, and further creating a greater sense of inner conflict by doing just that. In the essence of it, starting to see, oh, I know what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm doing right now. I must be nursing a thought that has no basis other than my attention to it and my idea of it being real, being true. I don't have to know what the content of the thought is to notice the effect. And if I begin paying attention to the effects as a clear indication, my feelings as a clear indication of what I'm thinking, the feeling doesn't become a fact. It just becomes an accurate reflection of what I'm doing. The same thing a mirror shows. If I choose to wear an outfit I don't like and then look in the mirror and hope the mirror changes, it's kind of stupid to think that. And it's exactly what we're doing in our thinking because we can't see it as obviously as that idea of the mirror. But think about thoughts as reflections. They're reflecting on thoughts, on our impulses, on our choices, on the decisions we make, on the conclusions we come to. So if we're reflecting on it, if we're the observer, we're actually able to watch all those things. And consideration is the watchfulness of those things because we're considering them as actually being what they are, as they are, doing what they're doing, as a product of what we've asked them to do, of what we've chosen that they do. And that can be a little sickening to look at because it's kind of like deciding to eat rotten steak or something. It would be repulsive. Normally, if you ever put anything rotten in your mouth, you know to spit it out immediately. This stuff we regurgitate and make believe somehow we're going to turn it into a healthy steak someday or a healthy glass of milk when it's rotten.
It's like eating cake all the time.
Yeah, eventually, in Haagen-Dazs, I was told, in the early days when everybody loved Haagen-Dazs, they let their employees eat as much as they wanted. And within 3 or 4 weeks, nobody ever ate it again.
Oh, wow.
They were afraid of them eating, like stealing. And they thought, no, the way to do this is just give them free reign. And within a short period of time, they'd have enough. They'd have overdone it and said, oh, I'm sick of it.
I don't think I could get ice cream.
So even good things that aren't in moderation are attempting to be better. And we lose the impact of the goodness in the things, even the wrong things. The goodness in it is seeing if we're where they're wrong, that's a great sense of clarity we have to notice that wrong. There's a goodness in that. There's an appreciation in that when it's seen accurately rather than as something to feel better about and get over. The addiction is trying to say, I have nothing to do with this, so there's nothing I can do about it. And so the only thing I can do is keep doing what I generally do, which is try to outrun it, try to escape it, try to get better, feel better than it, try to get over it. Doesn't help anything but reinforce the opinion that we're getting better at being wrong. That's not the goal of wrong. Wrong is there to give us direction. If we walk into a mountain and don't think it's there and keep walking into it thinking somehow our thinking will somehow eliminate it, we're probably never going to get over the mountain. So coming to terms is really the practice of principles in all our affairs. This is the inside job that's referred to. It isn't self-centered to do this. It's actually the elimination of the self by bringing the light, by allowing the light that's naturally in all of us to express itself in a brilliant, radiant, enlightened way, rather than a dark, depressing, shadowed, cloudy conversion that we make believe is who we are. It isn't self-centered to think inclusively of everyone. Stephen Hawkins said that in an infinite space, everyone's at the center.
Did he say it on Epstein Island?
Probably not wanting to be there, he tried to avoid that comment, or not wanting to admit he was there. But think of the difference between me being self-centered and you not being self-centered, or me being self-centered against you compared to we're all self-centered in the essence of self. Now, one is inclusive, allows everyone to participate in the exact same, we'll share the exact same bounty. And he was talking about an infinite realm. If there's an infinite realm, everyone is at the center because there's no edges, there's no borders, there's no boundaries.
Right.
Everything would naturally, you couldn't be at the end of it. You couldn't be at the beginning because there would be no beginning or end. And we don't need to assign that concept to a seeming power living in space that doesn't seem to be approachable to us or attachable to us or achievable for us because it's always out of reach. Think of that. Humans have largely created this idea of God as being in the heavens somewhere else other than here. That would mean we are more powerful than that power to overcome that power and be able to be disconnected from that power. That wouldn't be absolute power. It wouldn't be infinite. And we can think that if we want. But the wanting of that is exactly what we're going to make believe we're not doing because it's insane to try. And we know it. We're going to disavow having anything to do with it because we knew to admit it would mean we're insane, and it's not something people typically want to admit. It's an induced, imposed experience. It's not reality. Freedom of reality gives us the potential to make that choice, freedom to make that choice. If the freedom we have is absolute and we use it to feel condemned and contemptful, that is a choice we're making that is irresponsible. It is, and we are responsible for that irresponsibility naturally. And we know it. We know it, or we wouldn't suffer. Continuing. So that's a little longer than usual, our hour and a half. I appreciate this. Jackie, thank you for pitching in and
My pleasure. Thank you. It helped me a lot.
bringing your mom to be here. And listen, I know we've talked about this, and I know that the roots of these things, to the degree that I make believe I've resolved something, is the degree to which I'll continue to go about ignoring it. So the fact that I can get better about something doesn't mean I'm better in every respect. And leaving that door open and saying, I can consider this to the degree I can consider this right now, it doesn't mean there isn't more to consider. And all of a sudden, that embracing of it really creates the expansiveness to begin to notice it clearly, honestly, and come to terms with it. And also realize that there's probably, I may never come to fully come to terms with it in every respect. If it's possible to do, there's a good possibility I may do it on a daily basis to some degree. Collectively, as we talk about it, as we think about it collectively, I guarantee you we will witness serendipitous experiences, intuitive experiences that will be seemingly groundbreaking, while in fact it won't break anything, except the delusion we have about the limited nature of the thinking, because that intuition will absolutely express a sense of knowing that we will all know we know simultaneously and begin to operate on that basis more regularly, because the experience will have been introduced to our thinking rather than making believe our thinking will someday produce that experience.
Thanks, Chuck.
That's the wow factor. And yet it's so natural, so ever present, so ever ready, so ever willing, that it's always been our state. while we've been delusionally making believe it isn't. Contemplate that. Let's talk about it again next week, anytime during the week too. I'm around.
Thank
Love you guys. And anyone out there, by the way, anyone wants to join us.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Thank
Jana.
you, Jana. Thanks for sharing your Hawaii sky with us. Anybody out there that would like to participate in the weekly discussion, you're welcome. If you'd like to participate in a one-on-one discussion, you're welcome, either recorded or not. And I want to open the door to anyone interested having access, direct access. And we appreciate you listening. If you want to interact directly, you're welcome to. And I imagine with anybody here, including Jackie, Jana, Gabe today, Mark, etc.
Thanks.
Peace.
Again.
Peace.
Bye, thanks.
Aloha.
Everybody, aloha.
Love you guys.